Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going to be looking at something pretty fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
It's about how Islam views authority.
Okay.
So we've got this article. It's
Mm,
called "The Core Values of Islam: Why Islam Prioritizes Divine Authority Over Human Governance."
interesting.
And it really gets into how Islam sees itself not just as like a personal belief system, right? But as
Yeah.
this whole guide for like an entire way of life,
Yeah.
including how society should actually function.
You know what's really interesting about this to me is that Islam, it's not just about personal piety, like a lot of people might think.
Right.
It's about providing this framework
Yeah.
for everything,
Yeah.
from economics and law to family dynamics to social justice.
So like right off the bat, we're talking about something that's kind of different from how a lot of secular societies think about things today.
Right.
And, the article really focuses on this idea of divine authority.
Okay.
And I got to admit, I'm really curious to unpack that a bit. What does that even mean? What makes it so central to Islam?
Well, it all boils down to Tawhid,
Okay.
the belief in Allah's oneness and absolute authority.
Okay.
This is really the foundation of everything in Islam.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically saying that all power ultimately comes from a divine source.
So not from us humans.
Exactly.
Okay, so if we think about this in the bigger picture,
Yeah.
we're saying that presidents, kings, parliaments,
Yeah.
they're not actually the final word.
Right.
That's a pretty big shift, isn't it?
Yeah, it definitely challenges our assumptions about how power should work.
Yeah.
But you see, in the context of Islam, it actually makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Because if you believe in an all-powerful God who created everything, then it just follows that his guidance would be the ultimate source of authority.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So this raises another question for me, though.
Okay.
If this divine authority is the main principle, how does that actually play out in everyday life?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Do Muslims have to check some divine rule book every time they make a decision or something?
No, it's not quite like that.
Okay.
This is where the Quran and Sunnah come in.
Okay.
So the Quran is obviously the holy book of Islam,
Yeah.
and the Sunnah refers to the Prophet Muhammad's teachings and practices.
Okay.
And between these two, they provide guidance for all aspects of life.
So it's more than just rituals and prayers then?
Oh, absolutely. It goes way beyond that.
Okay.
It's about how you run your business,
Yeah.
how you raise a family,
Mm.
how you treat your neighbors,
Yeah.
how you govern society.
Right.
It's about creating a just and compassionate world in line with Allah's will.
That makes sense. When I hear all this, I keep thinking about this word justice.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like that's really at the heart of this whole idea of divine authority.
You're absolutely right. The article highlights several ways Islam tries to ensure justice. One example that comes to mind is zakat.
Okay, so for our listeners who might not be familiar with that, what is that?
So zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam,
Okay.
and it's basically a form of mandatory charitable giving.
Okay.
Muslims are required to give a certain percentage of their wealth to help those in need.
Oh, so it's kind of like a built-in system for wealth redistribution and social welfare.
Exactly. It's not just about individual charity either.
Yeah.
The idea is to create a society where everyone can actually thrive and where wealth doesn't just get stuck in the hands of a few people.
And this makes me think about something else the article brought up, the prohibition of usury in Islam.
Right.
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So usury basically means charging excessive interest on loans.
Gotcha.
It's seen as exploitative
Yeah.
and harmful to both individuals and to communities as a whole.
Okay.
So in Islam, it's totally forbidden.
It seems like these examples really show how this concept of divine authority isn't just some abstract belief.
Right.
It actually has real-world effects on how societies actually function,
Exactly.
how wealth is distributed, and how people treat each other.
It definitely does. And there's another layer to this whole idea of justice and accountability, too.
Hmm.
In Islam, you're not just accountable to earthly laws and authorities.
Mhm.
You're ultimately answerable to Allah for your actions.
So it's not just about trying to avoid punishment in this life,
Right.
but thinking about the eternal consequences as well.
Exactly. And this really encourages people to think differently about their actions and their impact,
Mm-hmm.
not just on themselves, but on the community and the world around them.
It makes me think about the potential benefits of a system that prioritizes ethical behavior and accountability
Mhm.
to something higher than ourselves.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering, what about human governance?
Mhm.
Does Islam just completely reject that?
No, it's not about rejection. It's about integration.
Okay.
The idea is to find a balance between divine principles and human input.
Okay, so how does that work in practice? Do you just like open the Quran and look for a specific verse to make every single decision?
Well, it's not quite that simple. Islam recognizes the value of human reason and experience.
Mm-hmm.
It encourages consultation and collaboration.
Yeah.
But the key is that these human efforts should always be guided by the values that were revealed through divine authority.
Okay, so you're saying there's this balance between divine guidance and human input.
Exactly. And we'll delve deeper into that when we come back for the next part of our deep dive.
All right, sounds good.
Welcome back. We were talking about how Islam tries to integrate that divine authority with human governance.
Yeah, we were talking about human reason and experience playing a role, but still grounded in those principles,
Yeah.
from the Quran and the Sunnah.
Right.
It's like having a moral compass,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm still a bit fuzzy on how that actually plays out when you have to make decisions.
That's a really good question. And honestly, it's one that Islamic scholars have been thinking about for centuries.
Oh, wow.
One of the key ideas here is something called shura, which means consultation. So it's about getting input from different perspectives, really thinking things through, and then making those decisions together.
So it's not just like one person at the top making all the calls.
Exactly.
There's this real emphasis on involving the whole community.
Yeah, definitely. And this principle of shura applies to all sorts of decisions, from family stuff to community issues to running the whole society.
This kind of brings us to a big question about how these principles have actually worked in the past.
Right.
The article mentions the Islamic Caliphate as an example.
Okay.
And I know for a lot of people that term might bring up images of huge empires and powerful rulers, but there's got to be more to it than that, right?
There definitely is. The caliphate is a really complex topic.
Yeah.
It wasn't just about one leader or some strict system.
Right.
It was more like this goal to build a whole society that really embodied Islamic principles.
So if we could strip away all the historical baggage for a minute.
Yeah.
What was the main idea behind the caliphate?
At its core, it was about creating a society that was just and fair, where leadership law and even social norms were all based on those divine principles.
So not forcing people to follow strict rules?
No, not at
Yeah.
all. It was more about creating a community where people could live according to Allah's will.
Okay. I can already hear some people pushing back on this, though.
Oh, yeah.
They might say, isn't that basically a theocracy?
Yeah.
What about individual freedom? What about the separation of church and state?
Those are totally valid concerns.
Of course.
And it's true that this idea of divine authority can be interpreted in different ways,
Yeah.
some good and some not so good.
Right.
But it's really important to remember that in Islam, this concept isn't about taking away individual liberties or imposing a narrow religious view.
So how does Islam balance divine authority with individual freedom and a just system that protects everyone's rights?
It's all about finding that balance. And it's something that Muslims have been discussing and debating for centuries.
Right.
But one key principle that helps is the focus on justice.
Okay, so let's break that down a bit. How does the idea of justice in Islam help with this balancing act?
Well, in Islam, justice is seen as one of God's essential qualities.
Mhm.
And it's this fundamental principle that should guide everything we do.
So even a system based on divine law,
Yeah. Even then, it still has to uphold justice for everyone.
no matter what.
Exactly. No matter their faith, their ethnicity, their social status, anything.
So it's not about forcing one set of beliefs on everyone.
No.
It's about building a society where everybody's rights are protected
Yeah.
and everyone has the chance to live a good life.
Exactly. And that includes things like freedom of conscience,
Right.
the right to a fair trial,
Mhm.
right to own property, the right to education, all of that.
All those fundamental rights.
Yeah, these are all central to Islamic teachings and seen as essential for a just and thriving society.
This makes a lot of sense, but it also makes me think about something else.
What's that?
We live in a world with lots of different interpretations of Islam, and sometimes those interpretations lead to very different ideas about how to actually put these
Yeah.
principles into action.
Yeah, that's true.
So how do we navigate that complexity?
You're bringing up a really important point. Diversity of thought and interpretation has always been a part of Islam.
Interesting.
And while it can be tough, I think it's actually a strength.
Okay.
It allows for discussion, debate, and this constant process of reevaluating and adapting.
So it's not about everyone agreeing on one rigid interpretation.
No.
It's about having these open and respectful conversations about how to apply those principles in a way that makes sense for today.
Exactly. And those conversations need to include people from all walks of life, from different schools of thought, different cultures.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's how we learn from each other, challenge our own assumptions, and come to a deeper understanding.
I'm really struck by this idea that diversity and dialogue are seen as such important parts of this process.
Yeah.
It's not about shutting down dissenting voices
Right.
or imposing one single worldview. It's about creating a space where all those different perspectives can be heard.
Exactly. And honestly, I think that's one of the things that makes Islamic traditions so dynamic and resilient.
Hmm.
It's not afraid to wrestle with tough questions, to listen to different viewpoints, and to evolve over time.
All this talk about justice and rights makes me think about the problems we face in the world today.
Yeah,
There's so much injustice, inequality, and conflict.
it's true.
So do you think this Islamic idea of divine authority has something to offer in dealing with these challenges?
That's a big question. And honestly, I don't think there are any easy answers.
Right.
But I do believe that those principles we've been talking about, justice, compassion, accountability to something bigger than ourselves, I think those have the power to inspire real positive change.
Can you give us any specific examples of how those principles could be used to address some of these big issues we're facing?
Sure. Let's take poverty, for example.
Okay.
Islam's focus on social justice and helping those in need, that gives us a solid framework for tackling economic inequality. Yeah.
We already talked about zakat as one way to redistribute wealth,
Right.
but it goes even further.
Okay.
Islamic teachings also encourage ethical business practices, fair trade, and being responsible with your wealth. These principles can help create a fairer economic system where everyone has a chance to succeed.
So it's not just about giving to charity.
Right.
It's about changing the whole system.
Exactly. It's about
Yes.
building a system that's just and equitable from the ground up.
That's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
What about things like resolving conflicts or promoting peace and understanding between different cultures and religions?
Well, Islam emphasizes dialogue and respect for diversity and that pursuit of justice. It gives us a foundation for building connections and resolving conflicts peacefully.
Yeah.
You know, the Quran actually says that all of humanity is one family, all descended from the same ancestor.
Wow.
So this idea of shared humanity, it really highlights how important it is to treat everyone with dignity and respect.
Regardless of anything.
Exactly, no matter their background or beliefs. That's a really beautiful idea.
Yeah.
But it also seems incredibly hard to put into practice,
Yeah.
especially in a world that's so divided by conflict and prejudice.
It definitely is a challenge, but I think it's one worth fighting for.
I agree.
And it starts with things like education dialogue, building relationships, and challenging those narratives that try to divide us.
It sounds like a long and difficult road, but one that leads to a better world.
It does. It's about creating a world that's more just compassionate and peaceful.
And that's something I think everyone can get behind.
Definitely. It's a vision that speaks to all of us, to our shared humanity, and that desire for a world where everyone can truly thrive.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation,
I agree.
but we're just about out of time for this part of our deep dive.
Okay.
Before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about.
Right.
We've talked a lot about the theory and the principles behind this idea of divine authority in Islam.
We have.
But what does it actually look like when we put it into practice? How can we as individuals and communities really live by these principles in our daily lives?
Yeah.
What are some real steps we can take to create a world that reflects those values of justice, compassion, and accountability to something greater than ourselves?
Those are fantastic questions. And I really hope our listeners will spend some time thinking about them.
Me too. We'll be back for the last part of our deep dive to continue this conversation and explore some practical ways to bring those principles to life in our own lives and in our communities. Welcome back to our deep dive, everybody. It's the final part of our exploration into divine authority in Islam.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, haven't we?
We have, from that core idea of Tawhid to the historical example of the Caliphate, we even touched on how those concepts might apply to some of the problems we face today.
Right. And I hope our listeners are getting a clearer sense of how Islam approaches this whole question of authority.
Me too.
Yeah.
Now, last time we left everyone with a pretty big question.
Oh, yeah.
We talked about all these amazing principles, justice, compassion, accountability to something higher than ourselves.
Right. But what does it really mean to live by those principles?
Yeah.
How do we turn them into actions both in our personal lives and as a society?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's no one easy answer.
No magic formula.
Not exactly. But what we can do is look at some areas where this idea of aligning our lives with divine guidance could really make a difference.
Okay, so where should we start?
Well, let's go back to something we discussed earlier, governance.
Okay.
If we truly believe that Allah is the ultimate authority, then our laws, our policies, our political systems, they should reflect his will as much as possible.
So it's not just about having a leader who's Muslim.
Yeah.
It's about weaving those Islamic values into the very fabric of society.
Exactly. And that's a challenge that requires a lot of deep thought debate and coming up with creative solutions that work in different contexts.
Because what might work in one place
Yeah.
might not be right for another.
Exactly.
This reminds me of Shura, that emphasis on consultation and community involvement.
It seems like that's crucial for figuring out how to apply those principles in a way that actually works.
Absolutely. Shura isn't just about making decisions, it's about making sure those decisions represent different points of view and that they really serve the whole community.
Speaking of concrete actions, we have to talk about social justice.
Yeah,
The world is full of inequality, poverty, and suffering.
that's the truth.
So how does this idea of prioritizing divine authority, as Islam understands it, help address those issues?
One of the most powerful things about Islamic teachings is the emphasis on social responsibility.
Okay.
We've already talked about zakat, that mandatory giving, but it goes way beyond that.
Yeah.
The Quran and the Prophet's traditions are full of examples about caring for those who are most vulnerable, the poor, the orphans, the widows.
So it's about both that personal commitment to helping those in need
Yes,
and pushing for bigger changes to create a more just society.
absolutely.
Okay.
We have to recognize that everything we have, our wealth, our resources, our talents, they're all gifts from God.
Yeah.
And we have a duty to use them wisely and with compassion.
Now, I know some people might be listening and thinking, this all sounds great, but how do I actually live this out in my own life? What can I do to make sure my actions match up with this idea of divine authority?
That's where the beauty of Islamic teachings really shines. You know, they offer guidance for literally every part of life.
Oh, wow.
For example, striving to do your best in your work no matter what that work is, that's considered an act of worship in Islam.
That's interesting.
Being kind to your neighbors, being honest in your business dealings, seeking knowledge, raising your children with good values, all of these things are seen as ways to fulfill your purpose as a human being and live in harmony with God's will.
So it's about recognizing that even the little things,
Yeah.
the everyday stuff, can have a spiritual dimension if we approach them with the right mindset.
Exactly. It's about giving our actions a sense of purpose, recognizing that we'll be held accountable, and trying to live in a way that benefits both ourselves and the world around us.
It's really about shifting your whole perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
It's seeing the world through a different lens, one that recognizes how everything's connected and the importance of living by a higher moral code.
You put that so well. It's a journey that each of us has to take on our own. It's about always learning, reflecting, and trying to match our actions with our beliefs.
As we wrap up, I think it's important to acknowledge that this whole topic of divine authority can be pretty complex,
Definitely.
maybe even a bit controversial for some people. There are lots of different interpretations, different approaches, and even some who might disagree with the whole idea.
Yeah, for sure. And that's completely okay.
Right.
It's not about forcing anyone to see things one way. It's about encouraging people to really engage with these ideas.
So whether our listeners agree with everything we've talked about or not, I hope this deep dive has made them a little bit more curious, a little more reflective, and maybe even inspired them to learn more.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The most important thing is to keep asking those questions, keep trying to understand, and keep striving to live a life that reflects our deepest values and what we truly aspire to.
Well said. And on that note, it's time for us to come up from this deep dive. Until next time, everyone, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for those things that lift your spirits.